Welcome to Smaart Talk, a series of video application notes, case studies, and general alignment discussion created in conjunction with our users. This time, we're talking to touring front-of-house mix engineer Fletcher McDermott about the quick spot check process he uses with unfamiliar PA systems. Fletcher, you often don't have a dedicated system tech with you on the road, right?
Right, I have to wear two hats quite often.
So you have to sort of fend for yourself. So what we're going to look at today is measurement data that you sent us from one of your touring shows where you walked into a venue that you hadn't worked in before, and you've got, 10 or 15 minutes to get that analyzer out and figure out what's going on with the system and kind of wrangle it into shape, right?
Right, yeah, not an install, not my design, just another day on the same show as yesterday, working with what I'm given.
So you told us a little bit about the venue. It was 1,000 capacity club. It's a concrete warehouse, which is everybody's favorite acoustic environment to hold a concert. We're going to look at the measurement data from the main array, specifically one side of the main array. And I think what's really interesting about this to me is that you've got a 10 or 15 minute, what we're calling a spot check on your new system. And you have a couple different goals in mind when you pull your analyzer out. So what are you looking for?
I want to make sure the system works as it should be. Left is left, right is right, positive polarity is positive polarity. I want to make sure that where I'm standing to mix sounds like the seats throughout the room as much as humanly possible. And I want to make sure that the same show that I mix every night still sounds like my same show that I mix every night. It shouldn't change so drastically because I have a different brand of speaker today.
Right. So if we can sort of give, kind of one word, boil those down to the 3 bullet points, you're talking about verification, which is the part about making sure the system's behaving properly and it's not broken. And we're talking about variance, which is, how consistent is the coverage over the space? What are you hearing at mixed position? And can you be confident that the audience throughout the rest of the venue is hearing something similar as you intend? And then the third one would be, I would call it translation, right? So, when you fire up your board mix, is it going to be reproduced properly through the system? How's it going to translate tonally or whatever? So let's look at a single measurement position. So you've taken your mic and you've kind of plopped it down in the coverage of one of the main arrays. And here's what we get. And, the PA's broken around 400 hertz?
300, 350 or so. Like, pack it up, go home, get a new PA. You can't mix this. There's no low mids.
We're stuck. So the thing that to call attention to here, if you look at the live impulse response pane up on the top here, we see 4 arrivals in quick succession. And that's sort of what we're contending with when we're in an acoustic space like this. You have a floor bounce. It might be a wall bounce. It might be a ceiling bounce. I mean, you said there was a back wall in play as well.
Yeah, a small little concrete boundary around the front of house position. So even though I'm not fully back in the room, there's still, 3 or 4 sides with flat parallel concrete walls, which even before taking out my mic, walking into this room, I knew I expected this type of reflection and measurement. Just, you snap your fingers in here and you hear it 3 times. You take a footstep, it's an empty room. It's all concrete.
So you're sort of in this sea of reflections. So if we move the mic a little bit, you took another measurement. This is about 5 feet away. And it seems to have fixed itself down there at 350.
and I think that is that 2 measurement example right there is just the best selling point for why there's no one, you don't take one measurement point and start EQing your system, because the entire problem just flipped on its head.
Right. So, there's really 2 components to this. There's the stuff that's consistent over the space, and that's the stuff that's going to respond to EQ that we're actually going to be able to have some effect on. And then there's the stuff that's really spatially distributed. And so, it's totally different 2 or 3 feet away. And that's the stuff that, like we're seeing here, good thing you didn't go in with your EQ and try to go after that thing that you were seeing at 350. Either way, either try to boost it or cut it. So if you had just looked at one measurement here, you could have really set a nasty trap for yourself.
Right. Yeah. You have to ignore that for the time being.
So if we look at the live impulse response now, you see that we have a different pattern of arrivals. So again, we're not going to get into an environment where we don't have those secondary arrivals, but by moving the mic, we've sort of just statistically shuffled them. And in fact, if we look, here is 4 measurement positions over the coverage of that same array. And so kind of walk us through, now that you've taken a handful of measurements, I mean, what are you kind of doing in your head when you see these datas overlaid?
So this kind of shows me that it's not as scary as it looks. I'm seeing a couple of big trends that are consistent across multiple measurement positions. You see there's a buildup of energy in the 1 to 2K kind of region, and then the low end also has a similar hump. The low end hump I probably wouldn't touch because I like some low tilt to my PA. That 1 to 2K kind of vocal range, I'd probably smooth out a little bit, but that's just one wide filter. That's not this scary jumble of, oh my God, there's 1,000 problems with this PA. That's multiple reflections that are going to go away later when there's bodies, the old sack of water thing. And I expect that the region between, 200 and 800 is when I have a mic that's 4 feet off the ground and 10 feet from a back wall. That's kind of the region where I expect home filtering to play around like that with these huge dips and nulls. And so it kind of makes sense to see that. So that first measurement doesn't scare me, and these variances don't scare me.
And what's interesting is if you look at the overall trend and like how well these traces kind of support each other, and they really agree for the most part for such a reflective environment. I mean, pretty much everything above 1K, those traces hang together very tightly. And when you're getting down into the low end of the system, again, there's pretty good agreement there. It's really that low mid area that gets really nasty. And that's
you say above 1K agrees, and I think there is the percentage of people that totally agree, and that those are very similar measurements, and this looks like a PA in a real room. And then there's people who haven't measured PAs in reflective environments that see that. It's like, what do you mean they agree? Like, I'm used to looking at my people's experience with this type of chart is what the EQ looks like on your console. It's super smooth, and it's a little hump where you put a 3 dB bump, and you see these squiggles, and it looks broken if you don't expect to see that.
Right. And that's a great point. So a lot of this comes down to expectation, like you said. You said I didn't freak out because this is what I was expecting to see on my analyzer, right? So you're sort of you just talked us through this trend that you're kind of picturing in your head. That's a technique that we call optical averaging. So you're really overlaying all the data and just spotting with your just with your eyes where those trends are, where they're similar. Right. If we look at all 4 of the live impulse response traces for those 4 measurements, we can see the mechanic here. What we've done, you move the mic around the space, and that really sort of jumbles those secondary arrivals, and you can see that they're still there, but we've sort of statistically randomized them. And so if we look besides the optical averaging, when we have all these overlaid, there's a couple other tools that we have at our disposal to sort of see through this spatial variance stuff, right? The first one is we can actually calculate an average. We can have the analyzer look at the traces that you've taken and calculate a mathematical average of them, which is this thick black line that we're seeing here. And so, I mean, this seems to pretty well match what you sort of mentally thought of as the trend, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it agrees with what I expect to see. The only spot when you average these together where you get a little anomaly is right at 500. There is still a pretty deep cut amongst the 4 averages. Honestly, when I see that, I'm just seeing that, well, I took 4 averages, not 40 averages. This is still probably the function of multiple arrivals causing cancellation there across just the 4 spots I happen to choose. I'm probably going to gloss over that because it doesn't sound real. It doesn't look real. If we had the phase data up for these traces, you'll see there's a little, it does that like 20, 30 degree just sudden jump right there between 480 and 500. And that is, key to a timing problem usually.
Right. And it could very well be a timing problem with the loudspeaker or the way the loudspeaker's mounted or right. Something like that. But, I think the point is this is giving you some more context on what you can expect and how you can expect the system to behave when you start putting filters on it. Is it going to be successful? So there's the, I think part of this also, like you talked about, having some experience interpreting this data and what your expectations are. So if you just put a single mic down, you're trying to move really quick, you're going to take a measurement from one location. If we look at how each of those individual measurements compares against that average, I think part of this is the trick of, hey, can you look at this individual data and can you see that trend? And it also highlights maybe why you shouldn't base all your decisions off of a single mic position, right?
Yeah, and you see that the average matches up to each individual trace for those areas that I said I would probably EQ, and I believe I did on this show. That 1 to 2K region has a general trend of being up by 3 or 4 dB in that region, and it's doing that everywhere. That is a function of the speaker or just the sound of that room that everybody in the room is going to hear and I want to take care of.
Right.
It's not the crazy 18 dB dip at the tightest Q imaginable. That is really just because the mic is occupying that one space and time.
Right. So obviously we don't want to be going after all this stuff that when you move the mic a foot, it's going to go away. I mean, like the fact that this is common to all the traces means that you have a good shot at success if you do go after that with processing.
Right.
And let's talk a little bit about floor bounce, because this is kind of the thing that, as soon as we start talking about putting a microphone in a space and taking measurements, the first question is always, well, what about floor bounce, right? Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about, we're going to look at a couple measurements that you took here of a downfill.
Yeah, it was a center hung downfill box. It kind of filled the space of what a front fill, like a lip fill, would do for this room. They just happened to have it mounted on the proscenium there. So it's probably pointed down at around 70 degrees, and you're getting that direct floor bounce behind the mic back into the mic. So you'll see these measurements. They're all from the same microphone position, mic stand wise on the floor, but the heights of the mic are being varied. So that kind of almost plays into when you're measuring an array that's firing straight back and I'm walking the mic, it's that back wall varying. And for this measurement, the floor is my back wall.
So what's really cool about, it's a sort of a textbook example of a floor bounce. It's really clear on the live IR. You can absolutely see the effect of the comb filter and the phase and the magnitude. And it's sort of a nice little isolated case where the only thing that changed between the measurements that we're going to see is the height of the mic. And so therefore its relationship with that floor bounce. So if we look at those 3 impulse responses, we can see that, we're sort of randomizing that as you lower the mic, we're bringing that second arrival closer and closer in time. And so if we look at those 3 measurements sort of composite on top of each other, and again, we've generated an average here in black. I put a little yellow bar in here, and that's sort of what you're seeing in your head, right, when you look at this data?
Right. That's what you look through all the squiggles. That first time you open Smaart after you sat through the SOFO sessions and you're looking to measure your first loudspeaker, and you just see these squiggly lines, and it's terrifying if you don't expect to see them. And it's, how can I EQ out all these problems? And eventually you look for that flat line across the peaks, and it's like, no, this is actually what I'm hearing in the space. Mm-hmm. This is actually the real information that I need to worry about. And really, this box, minus a large top end shelf there, just because I'm pretty sure the preset was meant to throw 100 feet and it was really throwing 20 feet, so it had a little compensation in the top. This box is totally flat from 300 to 8K, the region that this fill box is really occupying. So
yeah, and I think, like you said, that can definitely look alarming, but the overall trend, the story, the general narrative here, these traces definitely agree on. And if we look at how well they hang together, from 1K and up, and again, down in the low frequency region, it's really this area 250, 500 in there. That's where we're seeing this really big variance from trace to trace. In fact, if we look at a close-up of that, you can see that that's the area where we really are getting some severe variation in here. And that is right on schedule for a floor bounce. That's kind of the frequency range where we would expect those issues to manifest. And so this is kind of a good example of why you don't want to just take one measurement there and start going in and trying to get really surgical with your EQ.
Or even if you, depending the angle of the speaker, not changing your height, but having a constant boundary is going to give you a constant comb filter at a constant frequency. That might fool you into thinking that is something that's EQable because you see it in 3 measurements. It's important to make sure you varied all of those obvious reflections, whether that be the floor or a wall or a ceiling, depending on the height of the room. Make sure you're randomizing for multiple variables there, not just one.
Sure. So we talked about optical averaging. We talked about having the analyzer do a mathematical average for you. We have yet another tool in our tool set here to kind of penetrate this the murkiness of the spatial variant stuff. We have smoothing. So here we've got those same three traces with no smoothing, and then we're adding progressively more smoothing until we get to down here we have octave wide smoothing, and those traces, the more smoothing we add, the more they start to really agree, and they're really telling us the same story,
Right.
which is sort of what you were doing in your head, looking at the unsmoothed data. But I think there's some interesting conversation to have here about where are you working generally when if I were looking over your shoulder when you're doing your measurement, what are you doing in terms of smoothing?
I'm usually either at no smoothing or at 24th of an octave smoothing. I want to see as much of the data as possible, really just because most of my measurements are happening in those 20 minutes before sound check, 10 minutes before sound check. This is, I'm running through this, I'm playing one song, and then the band is on stage. I don't have a whole day of a dead venue to do an install and really check my, data here over and over and over again. Me and you have spent more time talking about this data in the last 30 minutes than I did the day of the show. These decisions were made, just there was no talking about it. So looking at it with no smoothing, getting what I need to get out of it, and mentally I am doing the process of what that octave smoothing gives you. That gold line from the last slide kind of matches up very nicely with what you see for most of the data on the octave wide smoothing. But if there were a problem, say, house engineer left in a crazy notch filter that helps out his SM58 capsules for feedback, but I'm not using that mic and I don't need his notch filter starting off on my entire PA, but he left it in by accident. And that, 18 dB cut at a super tight Q, when you smooth it out to a whole octave, becomes a 2 dB or 3 dB bump there that I wouldn't see if I was looking at super smooth data all the time. So I'll look at the raw data to see if I find problems. And this venue really, it sounded good. I was fine. I didn't find those problems. This is, most of this data from top to bottom was just I need a filter here. I might put something to taste here or there, but it all helped for that, confirmation of, no, this PA was working correctly. The house engineers were on their game. They didn't leave me booby traps of, crazy filters everywhere. This was a totally fine system that just looks scary because it's a concrete room and you're seeing reflections and multiple arrivals everywhere. But at the end of the day, I got a working PA.
Right. And the general trends of those traces do agree really well. So you're also answering that question of variance. If right. I stand here or I stand here or I stand back here at mixed position, I'm hearing very similar response. And I think your point about smoothing is interesting because smoothing can it can hide problems if you're not careful. So maybe don't always just trust the smoothing. The really nice thing about the smoothing control in Smaart is it's on the top layer of the interface. So you don't have to be married to a certain smoothing setting. And if you're looking over my shoulder when I'm working, I'm constantly running that smoothing in and out because, like you said, it's helpful to look at the trend. It's also helpful to look at that detailed data because that's where I'm going to spot an issue that you're particularly taking these measurements in part so you can go out and spot those issues. So you may look at something like that floor bounce, and you may say, okay, that's floor bounce. That's going to probably go away when the audience comes in the room. I'm not going to worry about that. And you may choose not to act on it. But that doesn't mean we don't want to be made aware of it in the first place. So you want to be careful not to hide things from yourself. So, I think something to keep in mind in terms of a workflow is to try looking at your data with different smoothing settings on. And that gives you a lot more context on the measurement data.
Yeah, I'm usually just working quickly.
So
possibly too quickly for my own good, but.
Well, I think that's also a key aspect is that it's like we talked about on the earlier slides. You've developed the ability by experience with taking these measurements and interpreting this data. You are able to see those trends, which is something that just comes with experience. And we have found that more experienced users tend to use less smoothing. So that, that's something that it's a tool that's there for you to engage in whatever level that you feel is helpful.
Yeah, I remember from my first Smaart training, Jamie taught it at the old headquarters in Connecticut. And, the first time you see it, day two, we breaks out transfer functions and it shows you it. And it's like the whole room kind of has this like, that looks crazy. What do we do with this? And he's like, I know this looks bad, but I see my coherence is strong. I don't have wild wraps everywhere. And it's like, I'm not worried about the little squiggles and the little deviations. I see a PA that needs 2 filters. And to someone who had never looked at a transfer function before, I saw a PA that needed 800 filters.
So I think that's probably the main takeaway from our discussion here today is, the importance looking at multiple measurement positions. And, we saw some of the traps that you can get into if you just look at a single measurement position, and to give us context about, what's constant over the space. If it's consistent over the space, and then we can actually talk about, do we want to go after this with processing, or will it respond to processing? But also the bird's eye view, you're looking at the trend, you're kind of doing your optical smoothing, or you might be using the averaging, the smoothing, within the analyzer. You might be using, or the mathematically calculated average within the analyzer. So we have a couple of ways to focus on that trend and to not get lost in the little details. So we're looking for the forest here, not the trees.
Right.
Fletcher, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.